When I observe Alice's fall down the rabbit hole, I see more than a physical descent. I see the symbolic moment when consciousness loses its grip and slips into deeper strata of the psyche. In my work, I often describe dreams as journeys in which rationality collapses and the repressed material rises. Alice's fall represents precisely this fracture, the moment the ego can no longer maintain control. Her calm acceptance of the fall, her almost casual curiosity, is not realism, but the dreamer's surrender to forces she does not understand. The fall is long because the unconscious is bottomless. It has no floor, only layers. As Alice continues downward, objects float around her, disconnected from logic. Books, jars, maps, none of them obey gravity. This is how dream imagery behaves, liberated from the constraints of physical law, yet bound by emotional meaning. I spent years analyzing such images in my patients' dreams, always noticing how they reveal concealed wishes or fears. Alice's floating environment mirrors the drifting thoughts of a mind transitioning into sleep or into psychic regression. It is in these moments that the unconscious becomes most expressive, unfiltered by reason. I must emphasize that the rabbit itself is not merely a whimsical creature. It is the catalyst, the sudden intrusion of something strange and compelling that demands pursuit. Every neurosis begins with such a figure, a stimulus that disturbs one's psychological balance and draws attention inward. The white rabbit is a messenger of the unconscious, enticing Alice to follow the path she has long avoided. She does not chase it out of curiosity alone, but out of a deeper compulsion to confront what lies beneath her ordinary identity. The tunnel through which she falls is narrow, suffocating, and then suddenly vast. This oscillation reflects the architecture of the psyche. At times, our inner world feels constricted by prohibitions and conflicts. At others, it opens into expansive fantasies and desires. The rabbit hole embodies this fluctuation between repression and liberation. Alice moves helplessly through these stages, just as a dreamer submits to the shifting landscapes of a dream. In this sense, her journey echoes the analytic process itself, unpredictable, disorienting, and yet profoundly revealing. When she wonders whether she will fall right through the earth, she unknowingly touches on a fundamental fear, the loss of anchoring, of self-definition. Many of my patients experienced similar sensations when confronting traumatic memories or forbidden impulses. They feared that exploring too deeply would destroy them, that they would lose themselves in the abyss. Alice articulates this fear in a childlike manner, but its meaning is universal. The unconscious always presents the possibility of psychic dissolution, and yet it is only through confronting this abyss that one gains self-knowledge. As she continues her descent, Alice begins speaking to herself, narrating her situation. This internal dialogue is crucial. When consciousness becomes unstable, the ego attempts to preserve itself by creating commentary, explanations, and stories. These are defenses against the chaos rising from below. I have observed this behavior in dream reports and free association. The mind speaks to itself to remain tethered to identity. Alice's monologue serves exactly this purpose. She is, without realizing it, anchoring her ego while drifting deeper into unconscious territory. Her speculations about geography, about falling through the earth, and about meeting strange beings reflect the dream logic where intellectual thought becomes intertwined with fantasy. This is not childish ignorance, but a symbolic reordering of her reality, a transformation I have seen in countless dreams. The rational mind attempts to interpret what it perceives, but the unconscious distorts these perceptions. Alice is therefore caught between the need to understand and the impossibility of doing so. This tension is a hallmark of the dream state and of the neurotic condition alike. By the time she reaches the bottom, softly, as if the fall were nothing, Alice has already transitioned fully into the unconscious world. There is no shock because in dream logic, such transitions are smooth and unquestioned. The ego does not rebel, it adapts. Her journey into Wonderland begins precisely at this moment of quiet acceptance. For me, her fall is the perfect metaphor for entering the analytic space. A surrender to the unknown, a willingness to explore the hidden, and ultimately, a confrontation with the deepest truths of the self. When Alice approaches the tea table of the so-called mad hosts, she enters a scene that bears striking resemblance to the mental state of a person suffering from acute anxiety. I've often described how anxiety disrupts the normal functioning of thought, scattering it like fragments of a broken mirror. The tea table is precisely such a mirror. Crowded, chaotic, overflowing with unfinished gestures and nonsensical rituals. It is a stage where the mind performs its disarray. As I witness Alice attempting to sit, speak, and make sense of what unfolds, I recognize the struggle of an ego overwhelmed by stimuli it cannot organize. The Mad Hatter's obsession with time is not a trivial eccentricity. It is a representation of the anxious mind's desperate attempt to assert control. Time becomes an adversary, an entity that behaves unpredictably, refusing to obey logical sequence. In many anxious patients, I saw this same preoccupation. They feared the passage of time, or believed it had stopped, or felt trapped in moments that would not progress. The Hatter vocalizes this phenomenon through his quarrel with time itself, as though time were a tyrant, punishing him eternally. Anxiety, too, creates the sensation of being trapped outside the natural flow of life. As the tea party continues, I observe Alice trying to adapt to the illogical rhythm of this environment. She shifts seats, follows absurd rules, and attempts to maintain politeness, behaviors typical of someone whose ego is attempting to cope with internal disorder by clinging to social norms. When the world becomes chaotic, the ego often seeks refuge in manners, routines, and language. But here, even those defenses fail her. Every polite gesture she makes is met with contradiction, ridicule, or irrelevance. In this way, her anxiety is not only triggered, but intensified. The March hare and the dormouse contribute to the scene's psychological symbolism. They represent conflicting impulses, agitation and withdrawal. The March hare behaves with erratic energy, leaping between topics and actions, whereas the dormouse drifts in and out of consciousness, barely present. I have seen these two tendencies coexist within anxious individuals. Anxiety can overstimulate, causing restlessness and hyperactivity, or it can exhaust, leading to lethargy and disengagement. At the tea table, the two impulses coexist simultaneously, suggesting a psyche stretched between opposite extremes. One of the most striking aspects of the tea party is its circularity. Nothing progresses. Conversations begin and end abruptly. Movements repeat without purpose. Seats change, but the situation remains the same. This repetition reflects the cyclical nature of anxious rumination. The anxious mind revisits the same thought patterns again and again, seeking resolution but finding none. Alice, despite her intelligence and curiosity, becomes ensnared in this loop. No matter how she tries to impose order, she returns to confusion. She is experiencing the paralysis of anxious reasoning. I must also comment on the hostility embedded in the tea party's humor. The Hatter and the Hare mock Alice subtly, undermining her sense of stability. They present contradictions as if they were truths and offer riddles with no answers. Anxiety operates similarly. It mocks the ego, undermines confidence, and replaces clarity with paradox. Many patients have told me they felt laughed at by their own thoughts during moments of intense anxiety. Alice's unsettled reactions mirror this experience. She's both participant and victim in a psychological environment that resists coherence. Even the objects on the table, teapots, cups, plates, seem to participate in the chaos. They are moved, refilled, stacked, or ignored without reason. These objects represent the fragments of thought that the anxious mind cannot organize into meaningful structure. They are present, but they do not connect. The ego attempts to gather them into a narrative, but anxiety pulls them apart again. Alice's frustration reflects the mind's futile effort to impose order on thoughts that refuse to align. She is not merely confused, she is overwhelmed by the disorder of her own psychic landscape. Ultimately, Alice flees the tea party not because she is offended, but because she reaches the threshold of what her ego can tolerate. Anxiety has its limits. Once the mind becomes too fragmented, the psyche instinctively withdraws. Her departure is an act of self-preservation. From my analytic perspective, the mad tea party is not madness at all. It is the dramatization of organized life collapsing under the pressure of internal turmoil. And Alice, despite her protestations, behaves exactly as an anxious dreamer behaves. She endures the fragmentation until endurance becomes impossible, and then she escapes into the next symbolic landscape of her unconscious. When Alice encounters the Cheshire Cat, she is not merely meeting a whimsical creature of Wonderland, she is confronting a representation of her own loosening identity. In dreams, and Wonderland is nothing but the architecture of a dream, it is common for the ego to appear in distorted, fragmented, or symbolic forms. The cat's disappearing body and lingering smile illustrate precisely this phenomenon. The dissolution of the self, leaving behind only a faint trace of coherence. When the world becomes unstable, the mind often clings to the smallest remaining piece of its identity, just as Alice grasps onto the cat's ambiguous smile. The cat's ability to appear and vanish at will is a metaphor for the unstable boundaries of the ego during unconscious exploration. In analytic sessions, I observed that the deeper a person descends into their internal conflicts, the less solid their sense of identity feels. They oscillate between clarity and confusion, presence and absence. The Cheshire Cat embodies this oscillation. He is both there and not there, offering guidance that is simultaneously helpful and disorienting. Alice, overwhelmed by the instability of her surroundings, relies on him not because he is trustworthy, but because he is the only consistent inconsistency she can latch onto. The conversations between Alice and the cat reveal another crucial aspect of identity dissolution, the collapse of logical thought. The cat speaks in paradoxes, riddles, and philosophical inversions, reminding Alice that the rules of her usual reality no longer apply. This mirrors the state of mind where the ego loosens its rigid grip and allows unconscious material to surface. The cat's language is the language of dreams, non-linear, ambiguous, poetic. Thus, when Alice seeks direction from him, she is not really asking for external guidance. She is asking her fragmented self to make meaning out of chaos. It is significant that the cat never expresses emotions in a human way. Instead, he smiles. The smile is perpetual, detached, almost mocking. This reflects a psychological mechanism I often observed. When the ego feels itself dissolving, it may adopt a mask of calm or humor to conceal the terror underneath. Many individuals respond to internal fragmentation with a facade of serenity, believing it to be protective. The cat's smile, therefore, is not warmth, but defense, a symbolic reminder that identity under threat may present itself as unbothered, even amused by its own disintegration. The cat also introduces Alice to the unsettling idea that everyone in Wonderland is mad, and that madness is relative. This plays directly into the fragile state of her identity. When the ego becomes unstable, it begins to question not only the external world, but also its own sanity. In extreme cases, individuals lose the ability to distinguish between their internal conflicts and external reality. The cat's declaration of universal madness destabilizes Alice further, pushing her into deeper confrontation with her own uncertainty. The more she hears him, the less she trusts her own perceptions. One of the most symbolic moments is when only the cat's grin remains floating in the air. This is identity at its most fragile, reduced to a symbol, a trace, an echo of what once felt whole. I have seen this in dreams where individuals appear as shadows, outlines, or disembodied parts. The psyche is telling them something essential is missing, but a remnant remains. The grin is the remnant. Alice depends on it because she senses that her own ego is similarly incomplete, held together only by the faintest thread of self-awareness. Yet, despite his ambiguity, the cat serves as a guide. This is typical of dream figures who inhabit the unconscious. They are not moral helpers, nor are they malevolent. They are simply expressions of psychic truth. The Cheshire Cat guides Alice toward choices, but he never tells her which is correct. This reflects the internal process of identity reconstruction. The unconscious can present possibilities, but the ego must choose among them, even while weakened. Alice's reliance on the cat illustrates that her ego, though fragmented, is searching for a path back to coherence. In the end, the Cheshire Cat is not a character separate from Alice. He is an aspect of her psyche made visible. He represents the part of her that endures the dissolution of identity with a strange and unsettling calm. As she navigates Wonderland, he remains the one constant reminder that identity can survive even when everything else falls apart, even if that survival is only a smile suspended in the void. When she looks at him, she is really looking at the last surviving piece of herself, asking it to lead her back toward psychological wholeness. When Alice first encounters the Queen of Hearts, I immediately recognize in this figure the unmistakable presence of an inflated and punitive superego. In my clinical experience, whenever a patient describes a voice that constantly monitors, criticizes, and condemns them, I know they are under the tyranny of their own internal moral authority. The Queen, with her shrill demands and perpetual threats of decapitation, is not merely a character of Wonderland. She's the very embodiment of Alice's internalized prohibitions, magnified to monstrous proportions. This is what happens when the child's early experiences of parental discipline fuse with the moral expectations of society. The superego becomes an omnipresent judge. As I observe Alice's behavior in the Queen's presence, something becomes quite clear to me. She does not fear the Queen because of any real danger. She fears her because she senses that this authoritarian force represents something within herself. The threat, "Off with her head," echoes the psychic annihilation she fears when confronted with her own impulses. The Queen's arbitrary rage is the rage of conscience turned savage, no longer a guide, but a persecutory force. I have seen this countless times in my analyses. The child who grows into an adult, haunted by rules engraved too deeply, too rigidly, into the psyche. You must understand, the superego is not born gentle. It absorbs prohibitions, punishments, and even humiliations from authority figures, and it stores them with brutal fidelity. The Queen's impulsive judgments mimic this internal process. She condemns without trial, without reflection, because the exaggerated superego does not reason, it reacts. Her fury is instantaneous because moral rigidity does not tolerate ambiguity. And Alice, caught between her own spontaneity and the Queen's draconian laws, experiences the classic conflict between id and superego, the battle between desire and repression. In Wonderland, where the usual laws of reality dissolve, this internal conflict becomes externalized and enlarged, making it visible to us in symbolic form. The Queen rules through fear, but it is a fear rooted in Alice's developmental history. the early lessons about obedience, punishment, and propriety that every child must internalize. I have often said that the superego is the heir of the Oedipus complex, and here its lineage is unmistakable. The queen does not nurture, she intimidates. She does not instruct, she commands. She demands absolute conformity to arbitrary rules that Alice does not understand, just as children often encounter moral laws before they fully grasp their purpose. Observe how Alice tries to maintain composure in the Queen's presence, even when nothing makes sense. This is precisely how a person under the influence of a tyrannical superego behaves, outward compliance disguising inward turmoil. She knows that any misstep, any honest expression of confusion or defiance could invite punishment. The Queen creates a climate of hypervigilance where Alice must monitor every gesture and word. I have seen this defensive posture in many adolescents raised in environments of excessive moral rigidity. They learn to shrink themselves in order to survive. But what fascinates me most is the Queen's fragility. Like the superego itself, she appears overwhelmingly powerful, yet she is secretly dependent on fear to maintain her authority. When Alice's courage momentarily rises, the Queen becomes flustered, almost childish. This too is a phenomenon I have observed. When the ego gains strength, when the individual begins to question inherited prohibitions, the superego's power begins to crumble. Its threats grow louder, but less effective. It blusters because it senses its control slipping. Eventually, Alice recognizes that the Queen's power is an illusion. The entire court, which once seemed formidable and threatening, collapses into absurdity the moment she refuses to be intimidated. This shift marks a crucial turning point, the ego confronting and demystifying the superego. In psychoanalytic terms, it is the moment when the individual stops experiencing their conscience as an external tyrant and begins to integrate it into a more mature self-governance. Alice's defiance is not rebellion, but growth, the ego claiming its rightful authority. When the scene dissolves and Alice awakens, we see that her confrontation with the Queen was not merely a nightmare, but a necessary psychic task. She faced the severest part of her internal world, the force that threatened to punish her for every step into autonomy. By standing up to the Queen, she takes a decisive step towards psychological independence. And so, in this chaotic yet revealing dreamscape, the Queen of Hearts serves as both tormentor and catalyst, the oppressive superego whose tyranny ultimately forces Alice to discover the strength of her own ego. From the very moment Alice begins to grow and shrink uncontrollably, I recognize a symbolic drama being enacted upon the stage of her body. In psychoanalysis, the body is never merely biological. It is the vessel through which unconscious conflict announces itself. Alice's constant oscillation in size is not simply a magical quirk of Wonderland, it is a physical metaphor for the emotional turbulence that accompanies psychological development. I have long observed that children experience themselves as alternately powerful and helpless, enormous and insignificant. In Alice's shifting stature, we witness these swings made literal and startling. When Alice suddenly grows too large for the room that confines her, I see the classic manifestation of ego inflation, that moment in which the developing child feels overwhelmed by her own impulses, desires, and ambitions. This is not arrogance, it is the frightening experience of inner forces that have not yet been mastered. She fills the space, presses against the walls, and senses that she has become too much. Many of my patients describe similar sensations when their drives surge beyond their capacity to control them. They fear their own intensity, just as Alice fears her expanding limbs. Conversely, when she drinks another potion and becomes impossibly small, Alice enters the opposite psychic state, the collapse of ego strength. She becomes, quite literally, diminished, unable to reach the key, unable to influence her environment. This shrinking represents the moments when the child, or the adult, feels inadequate, incapable, or powerless. I have often noted that such feelings emerge when the superego's demands become overwhelming or when the world appears too vast to manage. Shrinking is the body expressing surrender. In Alice, it is the visual language of self-doubt. These fluctuations in size are not random. They are triggered by substances she consumes without fully understanding them. This mirrors how, in human development, external influences, parents, teachers, social expectations, can cause abrupt emotional shifts. A single reprimand can make a child feel small, just as a moment of praise can make her feel big. Alice's bewilderment at these transformations reflects how the growing psyche struggles to interpret such powerful emotional stimuli. The body becomes the battleground where these messages are interpreted and misinterpreted. Alice's frustration during these transformations is telling. She reprimands herself, cries, negotiates, and pleads. Behaviors I have seen repeatedly in those undergoing developmental conflict. Her body does not obey her. It changes in ways she cannot anticipate or regulate. This lack of control is central to the anxieties of childhood and indeed persists throughout adult life. People seek mastery over their internal states, yet the unconscious asserts itself in unexpected ways. Alice's body dramatizes this conflict through its impossible shifts in scale. However, what fascinates me even more is the way Alice attempts to adapt. Each time she grows or shrinks, she tries to adjust her expectations, movements, and strategies. This is the ego's work, to negotiate between internal pressures and external reality. She learns that neither extreme size offers her true advantage. Too large, she becomes trapped. Too small, she becomes ineffective. This mirrors the psychological truth that balance, a stable sense of self, is not easily achieved but is essential for navigating the world. As the story progresses, Alice becomes slightly more adept at anticipating these transformations, though she never fully controls them. This gradual adaptation is symbolic of the developing ego's increasing sophistication. While she cannot prevent the fluctuations, she begins to understand their consequences. This mirrors how an individual, through self-awareness or analysis, can learn to recognize the patterns of their emotional oscillations, the moments when they feel big with anger or desire, or small with shame or fear. Understanding does not immediately grant mastery, but it is the beginning of autonomy. Ultimately, Alice's journey of growing and shrinking reveals something fundamental about the human condition. We inhabit bodies that reflect our inner lives. Our sense of size, of adequacy, potency, or insufficiency is always shifting. Alice embodies these shifts with a dream's literalness, transforming her emotional landscape into physical reality. In her struggle to find a stable form, she mirrors every individual who has ever felt torn between extremes, seeking the elusive balance that defines psychological maturity. In her changing body, we see the drama of becoming oneself. When Alice finally opens her eyes and finds herself back on the riverbank, many readers assume the adventure has ended. But from a psychoanalytic perspective, the moment of awakening is never a simple return to ordinary life. It is the crucial instant when the conscious mind attempts to reclaim authority after being overwhelmed by the dream's unconscious forces. I've long argued that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, yet the true psychological drama unfolds not in the dream itself, but in the transition out of it. In this fragile passage, the ego must grapple with the revelations it has just witnessed and decide what to integrate, what to deny, and what to repress. Alice's dream was not random nonsense. It was a symbolic exploration of her conflicts, anxieties, and desires. Throughout her journey, she encountered fragments of herself disguised as characters, trials, and transformations. When she awakens, these elements do not vanish. They linger in the psyche like ripples spreading across water long after a stone has sunk. The question, then, is not whether the dream was real, but how Alice's mind will deal with what has been revealed. Awakening is the moment the ego must confront the unconscious truth that the dream has dramatized so vividly. In the first moments after waking, the ego often attempts to minimize the dream's potency. Alice tells her sister the tale, but she recounts it in a softened, almost playful manner, as if trying to make it less threatening, more story-like, more harmless. This is a familiar defense. Many of my patients, upon waking from a troubling dream, immediately begin transforming its images into something less disturbing. They laugh, they rationalize, they diminish its emotional weight. The ego seeks to protect itself by reshaping the dream as mere fantasy rather than a revelation of inner truth. Yet despite her efforts to tame the dream, Alice is unmistakably changed by it. Her reactions upon waking, her disorientation, her desire to explain, and her vivid memory of the scenes indicate that the dream touched something profound. She stands at the threshold between two psychic realms, the unconscious that spoke through Wonderland, and the conscious mind now struggling to make sense of the message. This liminal state is delicate. The ego may integrate the dream's lessons, or it may repress them entirely, pushing them back into the depths from which they arose. Alice's sister, listening quietly, functions as a symbolic witness, the external world trying to absorb the interior chaos the dream has unveiled. Yet even the sister is affected, drifting into her own contemplative reverie once Alice leaves. This suggests that the contents of the unconscious, once expressed, cannot be fully contained. They resonate outward, influencing not only the dreamer, but the environment around her. In analysis, I have observed how a patient's dream can transform the atmosphere of the entire session, revealing truths that linger in the room long after they have been spoken. The process of awakening also reflects the ego's attempt to reassert control. After hours spent navigating a world governed by dream logic, where identity dissolves, rules shift, and emotions take monstrous form, the conscious mind must re-establish its boundaries. Alice touches the grass, looks around, and recognizes the familiar world. This grounding mirrors the therapeutic moment when a patient, after a deep exploration of unconscious material, must return to ordinary reality. The ego, though shaken, regains its footing and begins the work of interpretation. However, integration is not immediate. Alice, like many dreamers, carries the emotional residue of Wonderland with her. The sensations of fear, confusion, curiosity, and transformation linger beneath the surface, waiting to be processed. Whether she consciously reflects on them or simply feels their influence in her subsequent growth, the dream becomes part of her psychological development. This is the true value of awakening. It does not erase the unconscious experience, but offers the opportunity, though not the guarantee, to understand it. In the end, Alice's awakening marks the beginning of a new internal dialogue between her conscious self and the depths that Wonderland revealed. She may choose to repress the dream, treating it as childish nonsense, or she may allow its symbols to shape her understanding of herself and the world. Such is the task of every human mind, to awaken not merely into daylight but into awareness. The return to consciousness is not the conclusion of her journey, but the first step in integrating the truths that her unconscious dared to show her.